Nero's reign and the fall from glory. Emperor Nero is one of the most infamous figures in Roman history. His reign, which spanned from 54 to 68 AD, is often remembered for its cruelty, extravagance, and paranoia. Nero's rule began with great promise, but it ended in disgrace, leaving behind a legacy of excess and debauchery. His final days, however, were not filled with the glory and power one would expect from a man who once held the title of Emperor of Rome. Instead, his death was as pathetic as it was tragic, marking the end of the Julio-Claudian dynasty in a shocking and humiliating way. Nero was born into the imperial family as Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus in 37 AD. He became emperor at the age of 16, following the death of his stepfather, Emperor Claudius. At first, Nero's reign was marked by promises of a more just and benevolent rule. The early years of his reign were largely controlled by his mother, Agrippina the Younger, who had engineered his ascension to the throne. Under her influence, Nero began by making efforts to reduce taxes, increase the grain supply to Rome, and eliminate some of the excesses that had plagued previous reigns. However, as time went on, Nero's character began to change. He grew increasingly paranoid, and cruel. Nero's early years were overshadowed by his mother's control, but as he grew older and more independent, his violent tendencies began to emerge. He was known to have had his mother murdered in 59 AD, a chilling act that set the tone for the rest of his rule. He also had his wife, Octavia, executed in 62 AD in order to marry another woman, Poppaea Sabina. Nero's reign became increasingly erratic, and his paranoia led him to eliminate anyone he perceived as a threat, including members of his inner circle, military leaders, and even his closest friends. One of the most infamous moments of Nero's rule was the Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD. The fire, which lasted for 6 days, devastated much of the city, leaving thousands homeless. Although it's not certain whether Nero was directly responsible for starting the fire, rumors spread that he had ordered it to clear space for his planned palace, the Domus Aurea. To deflect blame, Nero famously blamed the Christians, a persecuted religious group, accusing them of starting the fire and using the incident as a justification for their brutal persecution. Nero's behavior during the fire became the stuff of legend. While the city burned, Nero allegedly sang and played the lyre, leading many to believe that he was indifferent to the suffering of his people. This image of a ruler indifferent to the plight of his citizens solidified his reputation as a tyrant. As the years wore on, Nero's excesses only increased. He indulged in lavish banquets, extravagant games, and performances. He even participated in public performances, singing and acting, which were highly unusual for an emperor. His desire for fame and adoration seemed to know no bounds. In addition to his reckless spending, Nero was known for his cruelty, and his reign became synonymous with torture and executions. He established a reign of terror, where the lives of his political opponents, family members, and even common citizens were at risk. As Nero's cruelty and unpredictability increased, so did the resentment from the Senate, the army, and the general populace. Despite the growing discontent with his rule, Nero's power seemed unassailable. However, by 68 AD, Nero's reign began to unravel. Rebellion broke out across the empire, with the Senate and the military turning against him. His once loyal Praetorian Guard, the elite soldiers tasked with protecting the emperor, no longer supported him, and the provinces began to revolt. The military defeats, combined with political instability, pushed Nero into a corner. The final blow came when the Senate declared Nero a public enemy. Realizing that his reign had come to an end, Nero fled the palace and sought refuge in a villa outside the city. Desperate and with nowhere to turn, Nero's final days were marked by isolation, anxiety, and fear. He was surrounded by people who had once adored him, but now saw him as nothing more than a liability. The emperor who had once been revered and feared was now abandoned by those who had once served him. How did an emperor who started with so much promise fall so dramatically from grace? Was Nero's descent into madness inevitable, or were there external pressures that led to his downfall? What do you think? Could Nero have turned things around if he had made different choices, or was his fate sealed from the start? Share your thoughts in the comments. Nero's downfall, from emperor to fugitive. As the political situation in Rome became increasingly unstable, Nero found himself isolated, with no loyal allies left to help him secure his position. The revolts and military uprisings, led by generals such as Galba and Hispania, were not just local incidents. They were signs that Nero's reign was rapidly collapsing. The Senate, which had long been frustrated with his tyranny, formally declared Nero a public enemy, effectively stripping him of his power. The very system that had once supported him now saw him as a threat to the stability of the empire. The announcement that Nero was to be declared a public enemy marked the beginning of the end for the once mighty emperor. His position had become untenable. The Praetorian Guard, once fiercely loyal, now defected to Galba's side. The Senate, too, saw Nero as a destabilizing force, and the public sentiment in Rome shifted dramatically. Even his closest confidants turned their backs on him, and he was forced to flee the imperial palace in fear of his life. In the hours following the Senate's declaration, Nero made his escape from the city with a few trusted companions, hiding in a villa just outside Rome. The once glorious emperor, who had held the entire Roman world in his grasp, was now a fugitive. Nero's final moments of power were marked by a complete abandonment of dignity. He went from being one of the most powerful men in the world to a person on the run, hiding from those who had once worshipped him. As he fled, Nero realized that there was no way back. His loyal supporters were few, and with his enemies closing in, he knew that his end was imminent. His mental state, which had already been precarious for years, rapidly deteriorated. The paranoia that had defined much of his reign now consumed him entirely. The man who once saw himself as a god among men was reduced to a broken shell of his former self. In his moments of fear and uncertainty, Nero turned to his final remaining resource, his wealth. He tried to bribe his way out of the situation, offering to pay anyone who might help him escape. He sent his emissaries to various cities in the empire, seeking refuge, but the loyalty of his subjects had all but evaporated. With every passing hour, his options dwindled. The thought of being captured and dragged through the streets of Rome in chains, a mockery of the grandeur he had once commanded, filled him with dread. As Nero continued to hide in his villa, it became clear that his end was near. The emperor who had once lived for extravagance and indulgence was now desperate for a simple way out. But the imperial system that had been his birthright had turned against him, and there was no one left to help him. The idea of returning to power was a distant dream, and the realization that he was a fallen ruler weighed heavily on his mind. It was during this time of uncertainty that Nero received the final blow, his own death. Feeling the full weight of his abandonment and isolation, Nero's mental state grew even more fragile. His once strong sense of self-importance had been replaced by a profound sense of terror and despair. Nero, once the most powerful man in the world, had now been reduced to a desperate fugitive, with no way to escape his fate. How did Nero, a ruler who once commanded immense power, end up a fugitive, destitute, and abandoned? What psychological factors contributed to his rapid descent from power to despair? What do you think? Was Nero's downfall inevitable due to his tyrannical rule, or were there key moments where he could have changed his fate? Share your thoughts in the comments. Nero's final moments, the pathetic death of an emperor. As the walls closed in on Nero and his fate seemed sealed, his life spiraled further into chaos and tragedy. In the final days of his life, Nero found himself not as the mighty emperor who once commanded legions, but as a terrified fugitive with nothing left. Desperation and fear filled his every moment as he realized that the end was inevitable. His legacy, once that of extravagance and power, was now tarnished by disgrace. In the days following his flight from the palace, Nero sought refuge in a villa owned by one of his former servants. It was here that the true extent of his fall from grace became evident. Gone were the lavish feasts, the adoring crowds, and the pomp of his imperial office. He was now reduced to a trembling, broken man, utterly alone in a world that had rejected him. His companions, the few who had followed him into exile, were too frightened to offer him any real help. They, too, knew that their lives were now at risk, and their loyalty to the emperor had faded in the face of the overwhelming tide of rebellion that had swept through the empire. The end came swiftly and in a way that was as pathetic as it was humiliating. Nero, who had once been surrounded by luxury and grandeur, found himself unable to escape the consequences of his rule. He was completely alone, surrounded only by his fears and the overwhelming knowledge that the end was near. His mind, already fragile from years of paranoia and cruelty, began to unravel in the face of impending death. At some point during his final hours, Nero began to entertain the idea of taking his own life, but he was incapable of carrying out the act himself. His former slave, a man named Epaphroditus, was reluctantly summoned to assist him. Even in this moment of vulnerability, Nero clung to his former sense of royal dignity. He initially tried to summon help from anyone who might have supported him in his final moments, but the loyalty he had once enjoyed had vanished. The Senate had turned against him, and the people had long since lost their reverence for their emperor. Nero attempted to flee again, but this time, there was nowhere left to go. He was informed that the Senate had officially declared him a public enemy, which meant that if he were caught, he would be paraded through the streets and executed in the most humiliating manner imaginable. The fear of this public disgrace was too much for him to bear. In a moment of complete despair, Nero turned to his final option. As he lay on the ground in his villa, trembling with fear, he requested his loyal servant to help him die. With the stroke of a dagger, Nero took his own life, marking the end of his reign with an act of self-inflicted violence. His final moments were not heroic or grand, as one might expect from an emperor of Rome. Instead, they were filled with humiliation, terror, and the crushing weight of failure. Nero's death, while tragic, was also a fitting end for a man whose reign had been defined by cruelty, excess, and the eventual collapse of his own empire. It is said that in his final moments, he uttered the famous words, "What an artist dies in me." This cry for recognition, even in the face of his own demise, revealed the extent of Nero's vanity and his need for validation, even in his most pitiful state. The irony of these words, spoken in the moment of his death, illustrates the man he had become, a once mighty ruler who, in his final hours, was reduced to pleading for recognition that no longer mattered. Why did Nero, despite his immense power and resources, end his life in such a pathetic and humiliating way? Was his death a reflection of his inner turmoil, or was it the inevitable consequence of his tyranny? What do you think? Could Nero have chosen a different path in his final moments, or was his tragic end a result of his personal flaws and the collapse of his empire? Share your thoughts in the comments. The aftermath, Nero's legacy, and the end of the Julio-Claudian dynasty. Nero's death marked not just the end of an emperor, but the collapse of the Julio-Claudian dynasty that had ruled over the Roman Empire for nearly a century. His passing ushered in a period of political instability, with the empire thrown into chaos. Nero's reign had been so deeply intertwined with his personality and the centralized power he held that his demise left a power vacuum that threatened to destabilize the entire Roman state. The emperor who had once been regarded as untouchable, whose every whim had been the law of the land, was now dead, leaving behind nothing but a fractured empire and a legacy of violence, corruption, and cruelty. In the days following Nero's death, the Roman Empire fell into a state of disarray. With no direct heir and no clear succession plan, the Senate declared the emperor a public enemy, an official condemnation that erased Nero's name from public life. Statues of Nero were destroyed, and his images were removed from coins. The Senate's treatment of Nero's memory reflected the profound rejection of his rule. Nero, who had once been adored as the ruler of Rome, was now a pariah, an embodiment of the excesses and failures that had led to his downfall. The year after Nero's death became known as the Year of the Four Emperors. This chaotic period saw multiple claimants to the throne, including Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and finally Vespasian, who would establish the Flavian dynasty. Each of these emperors was backed by different factions of the military, and the constant turnover of leadership further underscored the instability that had gripped the Roman Empire after Nero's death. The brutal competition for power, along with the public desire for a change from the madness of the previous reign, demonstrated the deep fractures within Roman society. Though Nero had been responsible for the destruction of much of the empire's internal order, the political vacuum left by his death was perhaps the most telling symptom of his failed leadership. Nero's disregard for the Senate, his cruel treatment of his political enemies, and his obsession with personal pleasure over statecraft led to widespread dissatisfaction not only among the aristocracy but also within the military and the common people. He had alienated almost every corner of Roman society, and this alienation fueled the uprisings that occurred after his death. Even his family legacy was not spared. The Julio-Claudian bloodline, once considered divine by the Roman people, was brought to an end with Nero. His actions, particularly the murder of his own mother and wife, left a stain on his family name that could not be removed. Nero had isolated himself so thoroughly that no one from his family or inner circle was left to carry on his name or his vision for Rome. His death marked the final end of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, and with it, the beginning of a new chapter for the Roman Empire. Nero's legacy, however, remains a complex and debated topic in history. While some ancient writers, particularly those who wrote shortly after his death, painted a picture of a tyrant who abused his power, others have suggested that he was not as evil as history has made him out to be. Historians like Tacitus, Suetonius, and Dio Cassius often portrayed him as a megalomaniacal ruler who indulged in extravagance and cruelty. These accounts, written by men who lived after his death, emphasized Nero's role in the Great Fire of Rome and his persecution of Christians, both of which became defining aspects of his reputation. Yet, some modern historians argue that Nero's image has been distorted over time. They suggest that the accusations against him were exaggerated by those who had personal or political reasons to discredit him. Nero's early reign had been marked by positive reforms, such as the reduction of taxes and the elimination of some of the most egregious abuses of power. His policies of public welfare, his patronage of the arts, and his attempts to reform the legal system have led some to view him as a misunderstood emperor whose later actions were influenced by personal insecurities and the collapse of his mental state. Despite these arguments, it is difficult to deny that Nero's later years were marked by violence, cruelty, and a shocking disregard for human life. His obsession with his own fame and legacy drove him to excess, and his failure to maintain the loyalty of the military and the Senate sealed his fate. Nero's reign, like his life, ended in catastrophe, leaving the empire in turmoil and his name forever tainted by the brutality of his rule. In the end, Nero's death was more than just the loss of an emperor. It was the loss of an entire political system, one that had been built on the absolute power of the emperor. Nero's inability to manage that power, coupled with his increasing paranoia and cruelty, led to his downfall and the collapse of the imperial order that had defined Rome for generations. His final moments, pathetic and desperate as they were, serve as a warning about the dangers of unchecked power and the inevitable consequences of a ruler who loses touch with the people they are meant to serve. What led to Nero's inability to maintain control over his empire, and why did the collapse of his reign lead to such instability? Was his end an inevitable consequence of his excess, or were there other factors at play? What do you think? Could Nero have avoided his downfall if he had made different choices? Or was his fate sealed from the start? Share your thoughts in the comments.